Hi, this is Sue Jackson of the Book by Book blog, and I'm here with my February reading wrap-up. This is my book journal, and here I've got all the books that I read in February. I finished 7 books in February. I devoted the month to Black History Month, my reading month anyway, and that was really great. I read so many amazing books last month. So I'll tell you all about those. Some were on audio. I read a really good mix. There were some in print, some on audio, several middle grade books, some nonfiction, lots of fiction. So it was a great mix and a nice variety for the month. I started the month off with one of my Christmas gifts from my husband, Harlem Shuffle by Colson Whitehead. I loved Whitehead's The Underground Railroad. Just such a powerful, creative book. So I was really looking forward to reading the Harlem Shuffle. This is a very different kind of book than The Underground Railroad, but just as engaging and engrossing and informative too in terms of history. So this is set starting in 1959, and the main character is a man named Ray Carney. So Ray grew up with a criminal for a father, an alcoholic and a criminal. His dad was often gone for long periods of time, and when that happened, Ray would stay with his aunt and his cousin Freddie. So he and Freddie grew up kind of like brothers. And his dad's gone now. So his dad was involved in all kinds of criminal stuff. And his dad's gone now. And Ray is determined not to follow in his father's footsteps. He wants to be a legitimate businessman. And he feels like he's got a good start at it. He's opened up a furniture store on one of the main streets in Harlem. He sells both new and used furniture. He's really kind of getting into the whole, home decor and trying to get the best brands to agree to be offered in his store, working with the companies and everything. He's very proud of his store. His cousin Freddie took a different path. Freddie is kind of a small-time criminal. He is involved in, one thing after another. It's always something with Freddie. So at the beginning of this book, and Ray is now married and has a daughter and another baby on the way. So he truly does want what's best for his family and to build his business. And then one day, his cousin Freddie approaches him. He says he's involved with a big heist, way bigger than anything Freddie's ever been involved with before. These are big-time, well-known criminals he's gotten himself involved with now. They're going to rob a fancy hotel in Harlem, and Freddie put Ray's name in as a fence. Now, Ray does deal in secondhand things, and he has, on occasion, accepted a couple of TVs or radios from Freddie in the past. But he really doesn't want to become more of a criminal. That's kind of, something he's not super proud of. So, but Freddie drags him into this. And so that's where this starts. It heads on through the early 60s in Harlem. So it also gets into the racial tension at the time. A white police officer shoots a black boy during this time, and Harlem just erupts into riots. So you've got that historical backdrop. Whitehead brings 1960s Harlem to vivid life in this book. It is such a vibrant setting, and you get so much of the time and the place. It's a huge integral part of this book. But you also really get to know Ray. You're really rooting for him. You want things to work out for him. But throughout the book, he is torn between his legitimate life and the lure of the criminal life and the extra money that it offers. So I really enjoyed Harlem Shuffle by Colson Whitehead. Definitely recommended. My first audiobook in February was Kent State by Deborah Wiles. She usually writes middle grade books, usually historical fiction. I love her books. I've listened to several on audio. She's just a wonderful author. Kent State is really more for teens and young adults, and adults. This audiobook was so powerful. What she's done, and I recognize Kent State isn't like mainstream Black history. However, she has integrated Black voices into her retelling of what happened. And so it fit, and certainly I learned a lot. So I knew the broad outlines of Kent State. I mean, anyone who's heard Neil Young's song, Four Dead in Ohio, or grew up during that time knows generally what happened. But I didn't know all the details. And probably most people don't know the details, which is why Deborah Wiles embarked on this book. So what she does here is she kind of recreates about a week or so around the time of the Kent State shootings. And she has different perspectives. So the entire book is in the first person, but from multiple perspectives. So she's got, of course, students who were at the school at the time. So they're all of the characters in this book are looking back on what happened and telling their story from the first person, which is part of what makes it so powerful. So she's got students who were at the school, who knew some of the students who were shot. She's got, I'm trying to remember if there was a professor from the school. She's got townspeople from the town that Kent State is in. Sorry, I don't remember that right now. But talking about how frightened they were of the student protests. She's got, as I said, she brings the Black perspective in because she's got a Black student from Ohio State who's basically explaining two things. That these kinds of protests were erupting all over the place. And the police were responding in many places, including Ohio State. None of those other protests or violence made the news because no one was shot. But so he's there to tell you, listen, this wasn't just Kent State. This was happening all over. Oh, there's a Vietnam veteran also speaking because a lot of the protesting was about the war in Vietnam. And sorry, I lost my train of thought. The other thing the Black student explains in his portion is that it was different for Black students, that white students felt safe in protesting, and that for Black students, the stakes were a lot higher because, the police would more readily come after them. And he cites some of what happened at Ohio State as an example. So you've got all these different voices. And this is one of those books that I definitely recommend you listen to on audio because I was totally absorbed in the audio. It brought me right into the center of this story, which I think was the author's intention, both with the print book and the audio. So on the audio, each of those different characters telling their story in the first person is read by a different narrator. So you really feel like you are in a room with these people, each telling you their own personal story, their remembrances of what happened that week leading up to the shootings. It is just so powerful, so immersive. You feel like you are there. The overall effect was just so impactful. I was completely absorbed in the audio. Yeah, I didn't want to take my earbuds out while I was listening to this. It's a very short book, but incredibly powerful. So that's Kent State by Deborah Wiles. And I also recommend Deborah Wiles' middle grade historical fiction books, including her 60s trilogy. I enjoyed Revolution, and I've got another one, don't remember the title, on my audio backlog that I hope to get to this month. Next up in February was a quick middle grade graphic novel that I really enjoyed. I kind of read graphic novels like in between my other books because I can read them in like 5-minute chunks of time and kind of squeeze them in the cracks. So Marshmallow and Jordan is by Alina Chow, and it is set in Indonesia, which in itself was really unusual and attractive to me because I know nothing about Indonesia. I don't think I've ever read another book set in Indonesia. So this was really good. The other thing unique about this graphic novel is what you can see on the cover. The main character is disabled. Jordan was the star basketball player for her middle school. They've won championships with her as captain. Basketball is like her life. And then she's injured in a car accident. This happens like before the book starts. And now she's in a wheelchair. So there's not a lot of focus on what happened or how she got there, but it's just a fact of the story that Jordan is in a wheelchair now. And while she's still a great basketball player, you know, she's still one of the star shooters on the team. She plays around in her wheelchair with her team when they're practicing. Obviously, she can't play in their games anymore. She can't go with them to the championship. So, you know, she's remarkably well adjusted for what she's been through, but she's feeling left out. And then one day riding home from school, she meets a small white elephant. Now, no one seems particularly surprised when she brings a baby white elephant home, so I guess this is somewhat common in Indonesia. But the elephant is injured. It's hurt its leg. And Jordan's mom is a vet. So she takes care of the elephant's leg, and her parents agree that the elephant can stay with them while it recuperates. Jordan names it Marshmallow, and the two of them are soon inseparable. Her friends love Marshmallow. And one night, and this isn't really explained, but so there's kind of a touch of magic here. One night, Marshmallow creates a pool in the backyard for Jordan. And the next morning, he helps her get into the pool, and she can already swim, but she's never tried swimming since she lost the use of her legs. So she practices. He builds the pool where her basketball net is so she can shoot baskets from the water. And she gets the idea to try out for the girls' water polo team, which is also a very good team at her school and has a chance to go to the championships this year. So this is not a shoo-in for Jordan. She's an excellent athlete, but she is disabled. And the water polo team is not quick to accept her, particularly the captain of the team, whose scholarship rides on them having a successful season. So she feels, and her basketball friends feel like she's abandoned them. So she feels like she doesn't belong anywhere, like she's caught in between these two friend groups. But she's determined, and she works really hard after school every day, does extra practices on her own to get better and better at water polo. So let me show you some of the pictures. So this is her basketball team friends playing in her new pool in the backyard. Let's see. Okay. There's Marshmallow. So I'm showing you the pictures because it's one of the great things about this graphic novel. These are beautiful watercolor illustrations of a place that, as I said, I wasn't familiar with. So and it integrates the Indonesian culture into the story as well. So, that's her mom sitting next to one of the, it's either her mom or her grandma sitting in their sanctuary. There's a lot of emphasis on the food here. Her grandma makes her favorite foods for her. So, it's a wonderful story. It's a very positive depiction of a disabled child. But at the same time, this book also deals with some common middle grade themes, like, feeling left out, feeling like you're not good at something, being teased a little bit, not about her disability, but about, not fitting in. And so it tackles both her disability as well as some common middle grade themes. I really enjoyed it. And as I said, the illustrations add so much. They're beautiful. So that's Marshmallow and Jordan by Alina Chow. My next audiobook took me through most of February. It was a pretty long one. And that was Black Boy by Richard Wright. So this is a classic memoir that was first published in 1945. And it took me a while to figure out exactly when it was set. But I think it begins when Richard's a child. It begins with his first memories when he's about 4 years old and goes through his childhood and adolescence and young adulthood. And he grew up in rural Mississippi. And I think it's like the 1910s because at one point his town is celebrating the end of the war. So Richard and at the very beginning, he lives with his parents and his brother. But his father's not reliable. He leaves them. And his mother's left to try to somehow both earn money and care for these two little boys, which of course is a horrible struggle, especially at that time, and especially for a Black woman. So Richard is telling all of this from his own perspective as a child, not fully understanding what's going on. So his mother really struggled. At one point, his brother went to live with an aunt. And so it's just he and his mom. And they move around from one place to another. When they can no longer afford their house, they move to an apartment. When they can no longer afford that, they move in with his grandmother, which she's got a nice house, but she's very strictly religious and has some definite ideas about what Richard and his mom can and can't do. So it's actually very difficult for them living with his grandmother. So he goes through all of these different things. And meanwhile, he's growing up and better understanding the world. He learns to read at a young age, and he's thirsty for information. He loves school, but because they're moving around a lot, he's not always able to go to school. And he only goes through, I think it was about 8th grade. Eventually, as an older teenager, he moves to Chicago, earns enough money so that he can bring his mother and his brother up there with him. So it's a fascinating story. It's also horrifying. I mean, what he and the other Black citizens went through is just horrifying. There's no other word for it. But it's interesting because Richard is telling this from his perspective as a child. and he doesn't really understand what's going on. Why it's okay for a white man to hit a black man in public on the sidewalk, why it's okay for white people to treat black people the way they do. So, there's this growing realization as he grows up. And because he is smart, he starts to ask himself questions about why is the world like this? Why can't it be different? Some very difficult questions. Things are a little better in some ways up north in Chicago. But of course, at that time, and it goes through the Depression, there's still plenty of racism. It's a little more underground, a little more subtle than it is in the South, but it's still there. He gets involved with the Communist Party, mainly because they're talking about equality for all people, but gets disillusioned with that. So it takes you through much of his early life. I really enjoyed this memoir. Boy, it's another one. I read a lot of powerful books in February, and this one was as well. Hearing his first-person perspective as a little boy growing up in that time and that place was just really moving and fascinating. So that's Black Boy by Richard Wright, a classic memoir. So next up, I wanted to get ready for a book group discussion, but at the last minute, I discovered I didn't have the book. I could have swore it was on my Kindle. It was not. And that was on a weekend. So I had to wait a couple of days to get the book from my local bookstore, who was sponsoring the discussion. So I looked through my shelves. I've got a shelf with double rows of older middle grade and YA novels, books that I haven't gotten around to reading yet. They're all review books. Back then I was getting too many of them and couldn't keep up. So I picked out a nice short one, Ruby Lee and Me by Shannon Hitchcock. And both from the cover and the description, it sounded like it would also fit with my theme of Black History Month, and it did. So the little blonde girl on the cover is Sarah. As the book opens, it's the late 1960s. Sarah is supposed to be watching her little sister Robin, but she gets engrossed in the book she's reading and isn't keeping an eye on her completely. Unfortunately, that results in tragedy. Robin runs out into the road and a car hits her. She's very seriously injured, and her parents, of course, rush to the hospital. Robin's going to be in the hospital for months, so Sarah goes out to her grandparents' farm, where she usually visits in the summers especially, and she's going to stay with her grandparents while all this is going on, while her parents are mostly at the hospital. And now, the one good thing, of course, Sarah's horribly upset. She feels guilty because she feels responsible, even though the driver of the car was really responsible. But the one good thing is that next door to her grandparents' farm lives one of her best friends. Her name is Ruby, and she and Sarah love to play together. They've been good friends for years. Anytime Sarah's visiting her grandparents, she and Ruby love to spend time together. So that's the one good thing. At least she's got a friend. And, the beginning of the book is very much focused on this trauma that Robin and Sarah's family is going through. Sarah's horrible guilt that she feels. She's got a wonderful, loving relationship with her grandparents. But there's one thing Sarah doesn't really understand. Her grandmother is best friends with Ruby's grandmother. They live next door to each other. When they're home, they are very good friends. They help each other. They bake together. But Sarah starts to notice that if they're out in town and see Ruby and her grandmother, the two women barely speak to each other, just like a polite nod. And she doesn't understand that. And this begins to form a little bit of a rift between Sarah and Ruby, because the school, the local school that Sarah's going to be attending in the fall, is going to be integrated for the first time this year. So Sarah's really happy that she's going to have a built-in friend already, Ruby. But then Ruby explains to her that, no, it's just like our grandparents. We can be friends at home, but we can't be friends at school. So this forms a rift between them. So there's all this going on for poor Sarah. You know, she's worried about her sister. Her parents have to sell the house because of the medical expenses. She's going to be starting a new school, and now she doesn't even have her best friend. So that's kind of the setup here, and it goes through the beginning of the school year. Besides integrating for the first time, the school has also hired their first African-American teacher. So that's a big deal in town as well. So it provides that historical backdrop about what's happening and the racial tensions. It takes place in North Carolina. But at the same time, it is also about Sarah and what she's going through, her relationship with Ruby, her relationship with her family, and her worries about her sister. It was a wonderful book. It's very sweet and warm, but as I said, it also, you know, touches on these difficult topics and gives you some insight into what was happening in history at that time. So that's Ruby, Lee, and Me by Shannon Hitchcock. And finally, drum roll, my book group book. I got my book group book, Kindred by Octavia Butler. Now, this is a book that, of course, like everyone else, I've been hearing amazing things about for years. It's been on my want to read list for years. This is the one that I thought I had on my Kindle, but that was a different Octavia Butler book that I still need to read. This was my first Octavia Butler. So I got this from my indie bookstore, and I read it in record time because I was staying up way too late every night. I could hardly bear to set it down. The tension is so amazing in this book. It's about a young woman named Dana in 1976 California. She's married to a white man, which was still slightly unusual at the time. They've got a new house, they're moving in, they're both writers. And as they're unpacking boxes, all of a sudden Dana starts to feel strange. She starts to feel nauseous, a little headachy, a little dizzy. And the next thing she knows, she's no longer in their house. She is on the banks of a river. And she has no idea what just happened, but she can see a child out in the middle of the river drowning. So without even thinking, Dana dives into the water, pulls the child back to shore. He's a little boy, and he's not breathing. So she begins mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. She doesn't know a lot about it, but, you know, she's picked up enough that she can do it. And she resuscitates the little boy, whose name is Rufus. Now, while she's trying to bring the boy back to life and resuscitate him, his mother comes running over, screaming at her and pounding on her back. And a few minutes later, once Rufus starts to breathe and she's sure he's okay, Rufus's father comes over and points a rifle at her. And in that moment, Dana disappears from the scene and she's back in the living room. Now, her husband, Kevin, this would be a really hard thing to accept or believe, except that she was only gone a few seconds in modern time. But she's soaking wet, covered with mud, and there are bruises on her back from where the mother was hitting her. So Kevin really has no choice but to accept her explanation of what happened. And it begins to happen more. Each time Dana is pulled back into the past, well, first of all, she finds out the next time that her first visit was in 1815. It's a plantation in Maryland. And Dana knows that her own ancestors came from a plantation in Maryland. So she keeps getting pulled back into time. And what they realize is happening is that whenever Rufus's life is in danger, somehow he calls Dana to him. She shows up. They realize that time passes differently. At one point, she stays in the past for 8 months, and it's only been either the same day or a couple of days in 1976. So time passes differently. She has no idea why this is happening, but clearly it's to save Rufus's life again and again. He's kind of a reckless kid. And she always goes back to her own time when her own life is in danger, like when Rufus's father pointed the gun at her. There is so much depth to this book. Her experiences in the past, she gets to know the people on the plantation. Obviously, because of her skin color, she has to live and work with the slaves. Even though she's explained to Rufus and his father that she's a free black. I was just completely blown away by this book. It is, I know I've used this word before this month, but so powerful. And in the book group, we all agreed that the contrast of having a modern woman go back in time and experience what it was like to be a black woman on a plantation at that time was far more powerful than if it had just been a story set in the past. The contrast between her modern life and what she experiences on the plantation just makes it all the more startling. It's an incredible book. There's a lot of suspense here. Is she going to go back this time? How's she going to get back home? What's going to happen to her? There are so many questions, so many what ifs. And as Rufus grows, the two of them respect each other. They've kind of got an understanding. Rufus knows she's saving his life again and again. But at the same time, Rufus has been brought up in this time where blacks are not only lesser people, but many whites consider them basically animals. So, incredibly powerful story. I'm so glad I finally read it. We had a great discussion in book group. Highly, highly recommend Kindred by Octavia Butler. I know this will be in my top 10 of the year, even though I read it in February. And finally, I wrapped up my February with one last audio. I didn't have a lot of time, so I fit in one more middle grade audio, again related to Black History Month. And it was Behind the Mountains by Edwidge Dandicat. I keep trying to say that the Haitian way, and I know I'm not getting it right. The first half of this book is set in Haiti, and the second half is set in New York. So it's about a 13-year-old girl named Céline. I think that's the right way to say it. She's living with her mother and her brother up in the mountains in Haiti in a small rural village. Céline is at the top of her class in school. She's very smart. And her father is in New York, where he can earn more money and send back to the family. So they have a small farm up in the mountains, and her mom works to earn extra money, but they really need the extra that her dad sends. Their plan is eventually for the whole family to join them, but they're waiting for their work visas. Now, about this time, Céline and her mother go down to Port-au-Prince to visit her aunt. And while they're there, there's all this political upheaval going on surrounding their upcoming election. And while they're in Port-au-Prince, her mother and they're actually on a bus to begin the return trip home, and the bus is bombed. So there's all this increasing violence around the upcoming elections. She and her mother are both injured pretty badly. They're both hospitalized. Her aunt and her brother actually have trouble finding her for a while. So this kind of speeds their visas up, though. So once they're both recovered, they do go ahead and join her father in New York. And of course, that is a whole different world for all of them. It's a big adjustment. And so the second half of the book is about what it's like to be a new immigrant in Brooklyn after growing up in a rural area in Haiti. So both sides of the book were equally engrossing. Really enjoyed this story. It is beautifully told. The narrator has a Haitian accent, which just adds to it, but is easy to understand. I really enjoyed this book and going along with Céliane on this big adventure with her and her family. So that was Behind the Mountains by Edwidge Dandicat, and that was my 7th book in February. I enjoyed all of them. So if you want more information, it'll be down below. And I would love to hear about your reading last month. What was your favorite book read in February? Tell me about it in the comments below.